since you don't have any context for the Olivet Discourse, Derek, it might be good to provide a little bit of context.
Thanks.
So the Olivet Discourse begins in chapter 24, and at the very end of chapter 23, in his condemnation of Jerusalem, in verse 39, Jesus says, "For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" So the disciples are listening to this, and so they get the sense of Jesus is coming, right? So at the beginning of chapter 24, Jesus leaves the temple. That leaving the temple is an act of finality and an act of final prophetic condemnation. He'll never return to the temple again. And to emphasize that, Matthew sort of says, left the temple and was going away, which is redundant. The redundancy is deliberate. And then, so they're at the Mount of Olives. We're going to the Mount of Olives, which commands a really spectacular view of the temple. And earlier, Jesus had said that in verse 38 of chapter 23, "Behold, your house is forsaken and desolate." So on the one hand, we have this vista with the majesty of the temple. And on the other hand, Jesus' pronouncement that the temple will be left desolate, which makes no sense. It's counterintuitive. There's this contrast between the magnificence of the temple and Jesus saying that your house will be left desolate, which makes no sense at a number of levels, both given the beauty of the temple, the real struggle of the Israelites to build the second temple, and then Herod's renovation of the second temple. And of course, the temple is really the center of Jewish worship. So it's inconceivable that the temple can be left desolate. So the disciples make a comment to point out the buildings, and Jesus answers, "You see all of these, do you not?" This is in verse 2 of chapter 24. "Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." So the disciples then ask, when will this be? When will there not be one stone upon another? And then they ask, going back to his statement about blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, they ask, what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age? For coming, in their question, they use the word parousia, which is significant. Parousia is the reception given upon to a dignitary, and especially the king, upon his arrival. And in Christianity, it's been used to refer to the second coming of Christ. So their question is about the second coming. So now they've asked two questions, and Jesus then proceeds to answer those two questions very directly and in order. Unfortunately, many interpreters have somehow missed the fact that there are two questions and Jesus answers them in order. And so we have all of this really generally horrible teaching and horrible interpretation about the second coming. So Jesus answers the first question starting in verse 4, and his answer to the first question extends to verse 35. He answers the second question in verse 36, and that extends through the end of chapter 24 and through all of chapter 25. So the uh, when will this be? Jesus is answers the question is about the temple being desolate. And so at this point, assuming that Matthew's gospel was written in the second half of the 60s, this is a prophetic pronouncement by Jesus. And Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled by the destruction of the temple in AD 70, when the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem and then stormed Jerusalem and destroyed much of Jerusalem along with the temple. And so the temple has never since been rebuilt. So Jesus provides 8 signs for the when will this be. He talks about false messiahs. Many will come in my name in verse 5. He talks of wars and rumors of war, which would be poor prophecy, except that he's speaking period Pax Romana when there aren't supposed to be wars. So wars and rumors of wars are in fact remarkable. He talks about famines and earthquakes, signs 3 and 4, which are but the beginning of the sufferings. So he likens this to, or the beginning of the birth pangs. So he likens the process of birth. And the important thing about birth is that it gives rise to a new thing that is intimately related to the things from which it comes. So a child is related to its parents. Here, presumably, the thing that gives rise to the temple being left desolate will bear some relationship to temple Judaism. Then he talks about persecution, the 5th sign, false prophets, the 6th, apostasy, the 7th, and the gospel of the kingdom being preached worldwide. That's an important one because the word for through the whole world is oikumene. And oikumene means not the world, but the civilized world. So it's the boundaries of the Roman Empire. And Paul believed that prophecy, Paul writes about the gospel being preached throughout the civilized world, oikumene, in several of his letters. So in the patristic tradition, that prophecy was considered fulfilled. So the word is not cosmos. So the gospel, it doesn't mean the gospel will be preached throughout the whole world. It means that the gospel will be preached throughout the boundaries of the Roman Empire. That's a prophecy that can have only a single fulfillment. It already happened. And then he talks about when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken by the prophet Daniel, then flee. The 8th sign. The desolating sacrilege is the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem. The Roman armies, their banner is an eagle. An eagle is an unclean bird. And so he urges immediate flight because the situation is grave. And he says to flee from Judea and flee from Jerusalem. The ordinary tendency in periods of conflict and danger and stress is to flee to Jerusalem because it's a walled city and it's safer than, simply being out and about. But here he's warning people to do something that is very counterintuitive. Um, and then he repeats after these warnings. He repeats his previous warnings about false messiahs. He talks about the Great Tribulation, um, which is both persecution and the decline of the church, or threat to the church, and false messiahs. So danger to the church from without and within. So he repeats that because he wants to particularly emphasize it, because the way in which you respond to that is under your control. The way disciples respond to it is under control. Um, and then he says, immediately after in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light. So there's this cosmic symbolism. So many people interpret those things very literally. But earlier in chapter 16, the Pharisees and Sadducees ask for a sign, and they particularly want a cosmic sign, just like the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, or the stars falling from heaven, to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. And Jesus says that no sign will be given except the sign of Jonah. So the interesting thing about the sign of Jonah is that it's a reference to Jesus' resurrection, and it's really an after the fact, vindication of Jesus. So prophetically, in terms of what the Pharisees and Sadducees are asking for, it's of no value at all, because when it happens, they'll have already condemned him to death. So what he's actually saying, then he talks about how they can read the sign of the weather, but not the signs of the times. Part of what he's saying there is that they are the sign. They are an adulterous, he calls them an evil and adulterous generation, because they are adulterous. They're adulterous in the sense that they misrepresent the one true God. They misrepresent the image of the one true God. And for that, they're adulterous. They're worshiping a God who doesn't exist, that they've created for their own convenience. And for that, they'll be condemned. And a typical sign of a cataclysmic transformation in history is adultery, idolatrous behavior. The day of the Lord usually arrives at a time of great idolatry, and this is such a time. So all of this symbolism is just symbolism. It's not to be understood literally, but the symbolism always points to cataclysmic political, social, cultural upheaval. And so this is the moment that the temple is destroyed. And he said, then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. It's a reference to Daniel chapter 7. Frequently, it's interpreted as a sign of the second coming, but it's not about the second coming. In Daniel chapter 7, the Son of Man is not coming to earth. The Son of Man is going to be presented before the Ancient of Days, before God the Father. So that's a sign of ultimate vindication. So in Christian terminology, Jesus takes his seat at the right hand of the Father. So Jesus is vindicated. So um, that's basically as that's basically where we're at. So we were discussing um, the the shortening of days and God's supernatural intervention in verse 22. So is that clear, Derek? Do you have questions?
No, that was good. Thank you.
So the important thing about this is that the second coming starts only in verse 36, and it's a profound mistake to attempt to read it into anything before that. So we were discussing the shortening of days, and I wanted to begin by reading Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1. So Hebrews 1:1. This is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. In many and various ways, God spoke of old to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the ages. He reflects the glory of God and bears the very stamp of his nature, upholding the universe by his word of power. So that those two verses contain a whole number of thoughts, but the important thing from the viewpoint of the Olivet Discourse and the days being shortened, is that Jesus, the Blessed Trinity, in some form upholds the universe. Christ through his word of power, the Holy Spirit through his activity, and God the Father through his conception. So through divine intervention, the universe flows in an orderly fashion. So then, another way of expressing that is that God blesses all of his creation. And as Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, causes the rain to fall on the just and on the unjust. So God's blessing extends to all. So the problem then arises when God no longer extends blessing and God no longer upholds some part of the universe and Christ no longer upholds some part of the universe through his word of power. And that happens. Then things simply take their toll. And so in the destruction of the temple, what we see is that everybody believed, each of the factions within Jerusalem believed that God was on their side. Each of the factions in Jerusalem believed that God would give them victory over the Romans, but also significantly that God would give them victory over the other factions who were in profound error.
Mm.
So the result was that each faction destroyed the other's food supplies, poured out and contaminated the other's water supplies. And the situation devolved into real barbarism, including cannibalism.
Oh,
So, for example, in verse 30, in verse 19, and alas, for those who are with child and for those who are nursing in those days. For those who are nursing in those days, the awful act of Oreb argues that Jesus has in mind here the fact that you don't want to be in Jerusalem when you have a baby, because the baby might be eaten. So the situation in Jerusalem evolved into cannibalism, which is, an unspeakable evil. So we have people thinking that God is on their side, literally eating one another. So that's what happens when God's blessing is withdrawn. But Jesus says, and if those days had not been shortened, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. What does he mean by that?
So the elect were told to leave right away.
Well, who are the elect and who are no human beings?
The elect are those who believe in Jesus and are following his word.
When
We're told to flee right away.
he's actually he's speaking much more broadly again.
Oh, okay.
If those days had not been shortened, no human being would be saved. So if those
Well, we're
days had
back to
not
the
been
what I just,
shortened, we wouldn't be saved.
yeah.
Previous generations wouldn't be saved. Future generations wouldn't be saved. No one would be saved. Why is that?
Because the church wouldn't survive.
Exactly, because the church wouldn't survive. Right? So it's a very, very specific reference. It's not, some tribulation sometime in the future is being shortened. It's not a, specific group of people being saved. No one will be saved if the church is destroyed, because the church is both the medium, the instrument, the medium of salvation, and also the church is the medium for for um, for propagating knowledge of Jesus. Without the church, we don't know who Jesus is. He's just one more person who gets crucified and dies on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
So the days are shortened so that we can be saved. So there again, we have, a clearly a very, very clear reference to the destruction of the temple, and to the fact that Jesus' warning is very historically specific, that it focuses on the destruction of the temple, that he's giving this warning because without it, the church might be destroyed.
So what happened when the city was destroyed? Like all the destruction was within the walls, right? Like when
Mhm.
everything happened, like ended, nothing came out and it spread it.
The temple was destroyed. I mean, there were some survivors in Jerusalem, and 60 years later, there was another Roman Jewish war, uh, which again was put down. This time it was made a capital offense for a Jew to be in Jerusalem. So if you were Jewish and were found to be in Jerusalem, you were executed summarily. The destruction of the temple began a real period of um, soul searching, of agony, of among non-Jewish Christians. Since the temple was the center of worship, that really raised the question of, what is Judaism and where do we go from here? And so over the next um, roughly 2 centuries, we see the emergence of Rabbinic Judaism, which is, instead of the temple, is centered on the synagogue and is um, really focused, besides observing um, the Mosaic law, apart from its sacrificial portions, on the development of Judaism as sort of an ethical and a moral system. And then this is also the period in which the Talmud is, or the Mishnah rather, is emerges to sort of cover all of the contingencies not not overtly discussed in the Mosaic law, so that it sort of closes all of the loopholes. So does that answer your question, Thais?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, in terms of the days being shortened, there's a there's a monument in Rome that celebrates General Titus's victory over in the Roman Jewish War and his conquest of Jerusalem. And at its dedication, General Titus said that he wasn't able to take any credit for the conquest himself because, in essence, Jerusalem had fallen like a house of cards. The uh, the forces, the Jewish forces inside Jerusalem, defeated themselves and had undermined each other, making it really a piece of cake for General Titus to take the city. So it's sort of a striking confirmation of um, the days being shortened and
So if
God's
they
blessing.
hadn't fought each other, it would have gone on longer, probably.
Right.
what you're
But-
saying? Okay.
Yeah, but the thing is that when events are allowed to run their ugly course without without God's blessing, things fall apart very quickly, and you see, in some sense, the nature of things exposed as they really are. The mask is removed, and you can kind of see what's really going on. That leads us up to the parable of the fig tree. And that part we haven't read recently, so why don't
Mhm.
I quickly read it? It's chapter 24, verse 32. For our evangelical, for fun, what are they called? Just premillennial dispensationalists. This is a really critical verse. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So the fig tree, so the significance of a fig tree is that the most of the trees in the Holy Land are evergreens. Fig trees are um, deciduous, and so they sprout new leaves in the spring. Figs are extremely important as food, not only as fruit, but they're used in not only eating as sort of fruit as we might, but also used extensively in cooking,
Mhm.
um, used in couscous. Um,
Bacon
mhm.
and baking. Yeah.
Well, not for Jews, of course. And so it, their fruit is really awaited, and so the new shoots, sort of indicate that summer is coming. And so Jesus is simply using this as an analogy. So just as branches put forth leaves, so the signs pointing to the destruction uh, indicate that the time is at hand, and the process ending in the temple's destruction is underway. The translation here, um, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. But there's actually no personal reference here. So it's traditionally translated as he is near at the very gates, under the assumption that the passage refers to the Parousia. But in fact, there's a basis for translating it like that only if you assume that the passage refers to the Parousia. Otherwise, it's best translated as, so when you see all these things, you know that it is near at the very gates. The it being the fulfillment of the prophecy, the it being the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem. So when you see all the signs, that's the when. So remember, Jesus was originally asked, when will this be? And he says, when you see all these things. So all of his 8 signs, including the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem, you know that the end is near. And here again, it is near at the very gates. What are the gates?
The gates to Jerusalem.
The gates of Jerusalem, right? So these are, we see throughout here very specific references. No one would be saved. We wouldn't be saved. No one would. The Pope wouldn't be saved. The Pope wouldn't be Pope. No one would be saved. It's at the very gates, a gated city, Jerusalem. So our premillennial dispensationalists have seen this as a prophecy about the establishment of the state of Israel, which is, in their opinion, a prerequisite for the second coming. And so initially, so Israel was reestablished as a nation in 1946. So it's generally thought that the second coming would occur, in that generation. But we're now 75 years later, which is more than a generation. And there's no good basis to, in any way, tie this to the recreation of the state of Israel. For premillennial dispensationalists, of course, the temple has to be rebuilt. So the nation of Israel had to be reestablished. The temple will be rebuilt. And then Jesus will come again to reign from the temple in Jerusalem. The temple will not only be rebuilt, but animal sacrifices will be resumed in the temple. And then Jesus will come again and reign from the temple in Jerusalem for 1,000 years, the millennial reign of Christ. As the fathers point out in their commentaries on the Lord's Prayer, the house is greater than the thing or person it contains. So if Jesus requires a temple to reign from, then the temple is greater than Jesus. And in that case, Jesus can't be God. Similarly, the future millennial reign of Christ, as St. Augustine points out, the millennial reigning for a millennium is not to be taken literally. A millennium is merely a long time of indeterminate length, simply a long time. There's no basis at all to assume that it's 1,000 years. It could be 300, it could be 1,000, it could be 2,000, it could be 25,000, just a lot. So from a Catholic viewpoint, the future millennial reign of Christ is totally unacceptable. It's a heretical belief. So then Jesus, and we started our discussion with this, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. So there's been an attempt to reinterpret this generation to mean the generation in which these things happen, some future generation. But that's absurd. Jesus is saying that people listening to him in their generation will see these events happen, will see this prophecy fulfilled. When we change the meaning of this generation, or when we simply ignore it, or if we assume that Jesus is wrong, then what we're really saying is that Jesus is a false prophet. He's bungled his prophecy. He, got something wrong. But in the Old Testament, and Jesus obviously, was part of the Old Testament prophetic tradition. In the Old Testament, false prophets get stoned, right?
Mhm.
So if Jesus bungled his prophecy, that means that he's a false prophet and should have been stoned. That in turn means that, we have this whole thing about the crucifixion and the resurrection. But if Jesus is a false prophet, he deserved crucifixion because he was a false prophet, right? He was misrepresenting the word of God. So in that case, we're worshiping a criminal who deserved to die. So that would seem problematic. And yet, many people are comfortable with that.
Mhm.
All you have to do is redefine what this generation means to turn it into, sort of make believe, and all is good. But that just is completely lacking in any sort of sense of integrity and any sort of sense of Bible scholarship. It just, it just won't do. But Jesus is clearly saying that these things will take place within the hearing of the generation to which he's speaking. And it did. Jesus is not a false prophet. But when we think that this entire portion of the Olivet Discourse applies to the second coming, we're transforming Jesus into a false prophet. I mean, Jesus is either the Son of God or he's not, right?
Yeah.
And he is, so then that means that this generation did not pass away until those things took place, and they've taken place. And then finally, I mean, I have some additional comments about that, but then finally, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. It's typically taken as kind of a doomsday prophecy. I'm going to come and heaven and earth will pass away. But that's actually incorrect.
Hmm.
It's a Semitism. So God created the heavens and the earth and pronounced them good.
Mhm.
God will not destroy the heavens and the earth. Heaven and earth cannot pass away. So the Semitism involves the um, a focus on the possibility of an impossible event to emphasize the validity of the second statement. So a better translation, or I mean, this basically is a literal translation, but a translation that expresses the sense of Semitism is even if heaven and earth should pass away, my words will not pass away. Or it is more conceivable for the impossible to happen, for heaven and earth to pass away, than it is to think that my words will pass away. So Jesus is arguing for the absolute truth of what he's saying. He's not saying that heaven and earth will pass away, or that everything will end in a ball of fire.
That's good because I was always super confused about this. It's like this heaven and earth passing away. It's like heaven and earth is still here. I don't understand.
There will be a new heaven and a new earth. And we can read about that in Revelation.
Yeah, but if this is
But
like related to the destruction of the temple, like heaven and earth is still here.
right, heaven and earth is still here.
So this is the end of the destruction of the temple, and now we're gonna start the second coming.
Then, in verse
Okay.
36 starts the second coming. We'll discuss the second coming, I think, next week. And at some point, I want to detour to Daniel and sort of the prophetic timeline. Um, maybe we'll discuss it next week. So one of the things I also wanted to mention, back to truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till these things take place. There's a tendency in some ways to focus on a verse and then kind of sort of backtrack and sort of ransack things to make it fit. And in some sense, one can argue that viewing the destruction of the temple, kind of fits that pattern. We have, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these take place. And so then, we have a train of thought, this generation has to not pass away. So it has to happen within the generation of Jesus listeners. So let's kind of ransack through history or whatever and try to come up with something that we can fit into the pattern. So we start with the presupposition and then we work our way backward, sort of mangling things as we go along to make something fit. And so we see that in particular, a really good example of it, of our separated brethren's attempt to prove that America was a godly nation founded on godly principles by Christians. They sort of, that's the starting supposition. And then you ransack history to get the evidence that you need, suppressing the evidence that would, contradict your position. In their case, suppressing most of the evidence and cherry picking a very small amount of evidence, since this was not a godly nation founded on godly principles by Christians. It was founded by deists predominantly, with a smattering of Christians. So, but in identifying the destruction of the temple, that's not really what we're doing here. The point is that everything here points conclusively to the destruction of the temple. And when we begin to move away from that, we can completely erase Jesus saying, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place." And nothing fundamentally changes. It's still clear if we look at the text carefully, if we consider the text in its context carefully, if we consider the language, that this is clearly a reference to the destruction of the temple, that it's not about the second coming. So this isn't a case of, starting with a conclusion and gathering the evidence for it. It's a case of everything fits together, and this is the only thing that can, that can fulfill Jesus' prophecy. Nothing else can fulfill Jesus' prophecy. Jesus' prophecy is very time specific and is very, unique. He clearly has in view the destruction of the temple and the end of temple Judaism. What's also interesting, the one of the comments of the particularly from the liberal German school, is that there's always a tendency in apocalypticism or in eschatology to see one's own generation as the last one.
Generation.
And so they argue, that that's true of Jesus, and that's why he says this generation, because of course they believe he's predominantly, sort of an ethical, moral teacher, not son of God. Well, what's interesting about the Olivet Discourse is that he's really not saying that at all. The eschatology, the foundation of the church is sort of a realized, as we realized eschatology and future eschatology before. The foundation of the church is a realized eschatology, and in that sense isn't very eschatological. So that characteristic that this is all going to happen in my time isn't really present in the Olivet Discourse. But what's interesting, is that we, interpreting it, make it present, right? So we typically, almost everybody who, talks about the second coming and interprets the Olivet Discourse differently than seeing it fulfilled by the destruction of the temple, thinks that Jesus is coming soon. And that if you sort of think about it, that's kind of outrageous. So the Olivet Discourse is being fulfilled under our very eyes. Book of Revelation is, reaching its fulfillment before our very eyes. And there again, the book of Revelation is also about the destruction of the temple. All of these things are being fulfilled before our very eyes, which means that they've been dead for 2,000 years and are suddenly coming to life. So they've had no real applicability to previous generation of Christians. And now suddenly in our own time, they do.
We think highly of ourselves.
We think highly of ourselves.
I always thought that Revelation was supposed to be about the Mass, but it isn't.
Well, it is partly about worship. I mean, it emphasizes that there are portions that emphasize worship. There are portions that emphasize the letters to the seven churches emphasize discipleship. We can see, sort of the pattern of worship of the saints in heaven. We get a sense of, the community of saints from the book of Revelation. So there are strong elements of liturgy and of worship in it. So that's very true. But they're all within context of the prophecy, John's visions of the destruction of the temple, and then in chapter 21 to the end of the book of Revelation of the new heaven and the new earth.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Okay, thank you.
So it's really it's the book of the book of Revelation is powerful and inspirational and
So the end
extremely-
times portion is from 21 on?
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
Then
I
I
wasn't in
saw,
your class, so
yeah,
yeah.
right. You arrived shortly after. Yeah, it starts with, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth.
Okay,
Mm.
thank you.
Mhm.